Welcome to Noisecutter.
And welcome to this episode of the Noisecutter Podcast. This is a readout of an issue of the Noisecutter Newsletter that was published on February 18th, 2024, and it's called Dating Apps and Elon Musk. Let's dive into it. So, dating app lawsuit. A group of dating app users have sued the Match Group, right? And that's the owner of Tinder, Hinge, and The League, in a class action alleging the company uses a quote-unquote predatory business model to addict users and actually inhibit the formation of real off-platform relationships. Fittingly, the suit was filed on the 14th of February, which is Valentine's Day. It also comes hot on the heels of Congress recently dragging various social media executives in to testify on the dangers associated with using their platforms, including, for instance, addiction. And we have some coverage on that, both in the newsletter and on the podcast. I think it's one or two episodes. No, it's 2 episodes back, I think. All right. So this one's kind of tough, right? On one hand, I remember the fun, but also kind of emotionally vacant days of swiping, matching, dating, etc. But on the other hand, man, oh man, am I so glad that that's no longer a part of my life, right? But, to be entirely clear about it, I did meet my wife on one of those apps. And I know a lot of other people who've met their significant others on them as well, right? But that's not fully dispositive of anything, right? The apps can be still both addictive and nevertheless successfully used for their stated purposes. The thing is, are the apps addictive because of some misleading, underhanded conduct by Match Group, or is it just an unfortunate fact of life that a lot of folks would rather swipe than date a person, right? But is that an argument that can be made in court, right? That this is just human nature? I can see this all getting very messy, right? But okay. The plaintiffs, to me, also got a little ahead of their skis at various points in the complaint, right? For example, and I'm quoting here from paragraph 74 of the complaint. Defendant has actual knowledge that the platform's features foster a substantial risk of addiction and compulsive use, as defendant intended that the platforms hold users captive to procure subscriptions. Plaintiffs and the putative class, lacking expertise in dating app development, are unaware of defendants' inexorable psychological manipulations which turn those seeking an off-app relationship into compulsive paying users. Defendant has superior and exclusive knowledge regarding both the attendant risks of the platform to facilitate addiction and compulsive use and the machinations of defendants' psychological manipulations. End quote. That's a lot. So to the first part, it'll be interesting to see what might come out in discovery regarding, studies and analyses conducted by Match. There's a line between knowingly marketing addictive products without appropriate warnings and designing and marketing a product that people just like a lot, despite potential risks to health and well-being. Diet Coke, anyone? Excuse me. To the second, I think the plaintiff is starting to stretch a bit, right? Does it really take, quote unquote, expertise in dating app development to realize that an app developer wants users to subscribe and pay for things like extra features? Isn't that just how most free-to-paid apps actually work? And there's a name for this stuff. It's called freemium. And dating apps are far from the only ones to employ that strategy. But there's something here about human nature. Whether it's swiping on faces or destroying little blocks of candy or doing some virtual farming or conquering the next village over, there's a lot of apps out there that profit off of providing humans with that next hit of dopamine from a succession of incremental, quote-unquote, achievements. Is it a problem? Yeah, maybe, right? But is it unique to dating apps? If you ask me, not really. I guess we'll see where all this goes. Oh, and of course, the next story in this issue of Noisecutter and this episode of the Noisecutter podcast is about Elon Musk. I feel like between Musk and Boeing, it's just a constant stream of noisy headlines that here on Noisecutter, we just can't help but dive into. So, Musk moves. Elon Musk's been back in the headlines lately, and this time it's really no less of a facepalm than the others. So basically, back in 2018, Musk arranged a pay package for himself with Tesla, which would pay him out over the course of 10 years. These things are kind of common. The package, which contained an equity component, hence a floating valuation of how much that pay would be worth, topped lists at the time when it was worth roughly $2.3 billion. And now the package is worth roughly the whopping sum of $56 billion. Shortly after the award, some shareholders were incensed at the value, claiming unjust enrichment on the part of Musk, and sued the company seeking to have it clawed back. Now, there's something to think about here from the perspective of a company's board of directors. Why do we pay people? Right? The answer seems pretty obvious. Duh, right? Because they do their work. Sure, but why do we pay people anything above the minimum wage then, right? And that's because we want them to stay at their jobs and keep doing great work. From a personal side, we think of it as, I'm going to do the best work possible and ask for the most money possible without the risk of getting myself fired, right? Or at least maybe we should think about work that way, right? Do the best and ask for the most. But from a corporate board perspective, there's a clear duty to preserve and grow as much value for shareholders as possible. So it's more like, we should pay people just enough to keep them driving company value and not one penny more. And that also kind of makes sense. A penny not paid in this quote-unquote overcompensation to employees is a penny saved for the benefit of the company's bottom line, and thus, arguably, the company's share price. And CEOs are employees of the company at the end of the day. But are they really? Particularly when they're also founders and large shareholders with deep ties and arguably some form of control over the board. In that instance, maybe not. But the rules still apply, right? And if it's not okay for Bob in sales to walk over and sweet talk Kerry in HR to add an extra zero to his paycheck, it's also not okay for Musk to exert whatever pressures he could over the board to get himself paid that whopping sum. And that's what the Delaware Chancery Court more or less found that he did. And there's a footnote here. I'm going to read that footnote out in line. There's an argument here made by, among others, former SEC Chairman Jay Clayton, that while Musk's pay package did balloon in value from roughly $2 billion to $56 billion, because that was due in large part to rising equity value, shareholders vastly benefited as well. And that's not a bad way to look at things, right? Because ultimately the goal is to do what's best for shareholders. And that's usually the same as make as much money as possible for shareholders. Here, though, it was the fairly obvious close ties between Musk and several of the Tesla board members, such as his brother, and members of management, such as Tesla's general counsel, who used to be Musk's divorce attorney, that cast a pallor over the notion that Musk's compensation negotiations were conducted at arm's length. The interesting question here is, if you do things at less than arm's length, but shareholders benefit anyway, was it still wrong? And the answer from the Delaware Chancery Court in this case is, yeah, it is still wrong. Back up to the text. Musk is obviously furious and is trying to shift Tesla's incorporation jurisdiction from Delaware to Texas. But this is harder than just filing some paperwork. And sure, states like Delaware earn tidy sums from companies incorporated there, so there's some financial interest of the jurisdiction to keep its corporate tenants. But it's also worried about protecting the interests of shareholders, and particularly minority shareholders. For example, the shareholders with a minority the shareholders with a minority voting power, but not shareholders who are minorities, right? This has nothing to do with minority identity. It's shareholders who don't have the majority of voting power. When companies try to switch jurisdictions because they're unhappy with, say, a judicial veto over an enormous pay package, that's when we worry about, what does this switch have to say for the interests of minority shareholders? And that's kind of what Delaware has an interest in creating corporate law around. But anyway, Musk is now claiming that Delaware is trying to block Tesla's move to Texas. And because of course he is, right? It's exactly what we expect. But is that accurate? And the answer is not quite. See, Prior to 2022, Delaware law required unanimous shareholder approval for transfer of jurisdiction. This has been the law for quite some time, and for a large public company with a vast number of shareholders, it's a virtually insurmountable bar, right? Like, think about the diffuse nature of Tesla's shareholdership. You think we can actually get a unanimous vote from all of them? It seems insurmountable at best. But in 2022, the law changed, and now transfer of jurisdiction requires only a majority vote of the shareholders, right? So it used to be unanimous, and now it's just a majority as of 2022. But of course, in our post-truth world, who cares about the facts, right? Isn't being right about how many social media followers one has than about what the actual facts of the law are and what the history of the law is? Don't answer that question. So what's the big takeaway here, right? Will Tesla reincorporate in Texas? Maybe. Will there be a flood of other companies shifting away from Delaware? Probably not. And what about on the origination side, where new companies seek out a jurisdiction in which to incorporate, right? There, particularly when VC funding is in the offing, Delaware is the vastly preferred jurisdiction. And in the initial stages, founders are typically looking for the safest path with the least resistance, ergo, Delaware. The advantages posed by states like Texas, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming aren't really appreciable when a company is just two guys in a room. And having to explain that we incorporated in Texas because Elon said to isn't something that's going to likely play well in the future conversations with potential investors, right? But who knows? It'll be interesting to see where things go from here, though it'll be some years, I'd imagine, before the numbers are really ready to analyze of what Elon Musk's whining has affected or has done to affect decisions about corporate formation and jurisdiction. But classic Elon. Classic whining. All right, and so we've got a couple other items in this issue of the Noisecutter Newsletter available at noisecutter.substack.com that we are not going to cover here in this podcast episode. So to access those, you're going to have to head over to the Substack and subscribe there to get, and for free, to get issues of the newsletter directly as they come out, and these podcast episodes will start to air in the couple of days following publication. And that's it for this one. So you can head over to YouTube. If you're watching this on Spotify or iTunes, if you want to see the video for this episode, that's on there, and vice versa. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and subscribe again to get these issues of these episodes of the Noisecutter Podcast out to you directly when they are published. And until the next one, I will see you. The Noisecutter Podcast is a production of Titan Gray, LLC, and is hosted by me, Rex Chatterjee. If you found our podcast helpful and want to say thanks, please head over to your favorite podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever else, and give us a review, leave a comment, and hit that follow or subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest. For more about our guest or this episode, head over to our website, noisecutterpodcast.com, where you'll find contact info for our guest as well as links to some of the things we talked about on this episode. If you want to reach us directly, just send an email to info@noisecutterpodcast.com. This recording is a copyright of Titan Gray, LLC, with all rights reserved. This podcast may be construed as attorney advertising, and prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, and your listening to this podcast or contacting us about it does not form an attorney-client relationship. No affiliation or relationship, including an attorney-client relationship, exists between us and our guests unless otherwise stated. For full terms of use, please visit our website at noisecutterpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time here at Noisecutter.